We are going to start the meeting of the Regulation and Discipline Committee. Are we recording? Yes. Okay. So good afternoon. Welcome to the Regulation and Discipline Committee meeting of the State Bar. As a reminder, this meeting is being recorded. Louisa, could you call the roll, please?
Broughton. Chen.
Here.
Cisneros.
Here.
De La Cruz.
Here.
Duran.
Here.
Sleg. Let's just. Okay. I don't see Trustee Sleg. Shelby.
Present.
Soul.
Present.
Stallings.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Great. So next on the agenda is a call for public comment. State Bar staff will attempt to call members of the public in the order that they appear in the attendee pool. If you're participating by Zoom, you can virtually raise your hand. For those participating by phone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9. Due to time restrictions, we can't allow more than 3 minutes for each speaker. Louisa, if you could identify any members of the public who wish to speak.
We have one member of the public, Nick Migliaccio. Your microphone has been enabled. You should be able to address the committee.
Ms. Chen, since the same people are available for this portion, can we just have my comments from before simply incorporated into this part?
I believe so. I think everybody here did hear your comments when you made them at the beginning of the executive committee meeting.
Thank you very much, ma'am.
You're welcome. Anyone else?
We do not have any additional members of the public who wish to address the committee.
Okay. Well, for my chair's report, in the interest of time, I will only say that we celebrate the confirmation of our Chief Trial Counsel, George Cardona. It was a long road for the State Bar to go without a formally confirmed Chief Trial Counsel for many years, and so we are really glad to have George officially confirmed. And with that, we will move to consent. Is there any member who wishes to pull an item off the consent calendar?
Madam Chair, this is Brandon. I would ask to move the item involving the mandatory fee arbitration item. And I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me.
So that's item 2B, the request for approval of proposed revisions to Long Beach Bar Association's mandatory fee arbitration rules.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, we will move that to the regular agenda.
I'll move approval of the minutes.
I'll second.
Great. Motion by Duran, second by De La Cruz for item 2A, the open session minutes from May 19th, 2022. Any corrections or modifications? Okay. Louisa, can you call the roll, please?
Broughton. Cisneros.
Aye.
De La Cruz.
Yes.
Duran.
Aye.
Sleg. Shelby.
Aye.
Soul.
Aye.
Stallings.
Yes.
6 ayes, 2 absent, no nays. The motion carries.
Great. Now we'll move to the regular agenda. Item 3A is the formal advisory ethics opinion 2022-208. Oh, sorry. That item has been withdrawn. So we're moving to the proposed amendment to Rule 3.513 regarding mandatory fee arbitration service receipt and dates. This is a request to circulate for public comment. And this item is being presented by Isabel Liu from the Office of Professional Competence.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So item 3B are proposed amendments to State Bar Rule 3.513. This rule pertains to service of documents and receipt dates in mandatory fee arbitration matters. So the rule currently states that for faxed and electronic submissions to the mandatory fee arbitration program, a hard copy is required within 5 days. in order for the fax or electronic submission date to be deemed the receipt date. So the proposed amendments would affect subdivisions E and F of the rule and would remove the hard copy requirement for electronic submissions. So in the proposed amendment would change things so that the electronic submission of a filing or other communication in a fee arbitration matter is deemed to be received on the date that the bar actually receives. And the purpose of these amendments is to make electronic submissions the preferred method of filing matters or communicating with the fee arbitration program. But we would still accept mail and fax submissions. This item requests that RAD approve these proposed amendments to Rule 3.513 and for a 30-day public comment.
Thank you. Any questions or discussion? Do we have a motion?
Cisneros, I'll move approval. I'll second.
Motion by Cisneros, second by De La Cruz. Luisa, could you call the roll, please?
Broughton, Cisneros,
Aye.
Dela Cruz,
Yes.
Duran,
Yes.
Saleg.
Yes.
Thank you. Shelby,
Aye.
Sol,
Aye.
Stallings.
Yes.
7 ayes, 0 nays, 1 absent. The motion carries.
Okay, so before we move to item 3C, which is an update on SB 211 case processing standards, let's take up the item that we moved off of consent, which is a request for approval of proposed revisions to the Long Beach Bar Association's mandatory fee arbitration rules. And we did hear public comment from Mr. Migliaccio of the Long Beach Bar Association with an issue concerning the jurisdiction of the Bar Association. I believe that that issue is not presented in what is before the RAD committee today.
It is not. We did approve a filing jurisdiction amendment to the Long Beach Bar rules. We expanded their filing jurisdiction to include all of Los Angeles County, but the program did not feel comfortable expanding that filing jurisdiction to include Orange County because it's our understanding that Orange County Bar Association had reservations and did not endorse it.
And so, Ms. Liu, what is currently before the committee for decision does not concern an expansion of the Long Beach Bar Association's jurisdiction to Orange County. So we would be voting on other stuff that doesn't have to do that jurisdiction.
Yeah, so it's all not controversial. I discussed this with Mr. Migliaccio, and he wanted to proceed with the rules that are packaged before you. He didn't want that one rule to hold up the rest of the rule revisions.
Understood. And so could we ask this State Bar staff to go back and take a look at this question about expanding jurisdiction and come back?
Yes, we can revisit it and come back at a later date.
Okay, but in the meantime, we should consider and put up for a vote what is currently before us.
Yes, item 2B is not controversial, yes.
Great. Any questions or discussion? Mr.
So Madam Chair, this is Brandon. So that was my question, because I received the public comment from the Orange County Bar Association. And I guess my question is whether or not this rule, as is currently being passed out of the board today, if that could be used to expand Long Beach Bar Association's jurisdiction into Orange County. And it sounds like it does not.
No.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Any other discussion or questions?
Madam Chair, I'll move the item.
I'll second that.
Great.
Duran.
Thank you. Motion by Stallings, second by Duran. Lisa, could you call a vote, please?
Broughton, Cisneros,
Aye.
Dela Cruz,
Yes.
Duran,
Aye.
Saleg,
Yes.
Shelby,
Aye.
Sol,
Aye.
Stallings.
Yes.
7 ayes, 0 nays, 1 absent. The motion carries.
Great, thank you, and thank you.
Thank
Ms.
you.
Okay, next up is an update on SB 211 case processing standards. This item is being presented by the Chief of Mission, Office of Research and Institutional Accountability, Yun Shang, and Chief Trial Counsel George Cardona. Great, the floor is yours.
Is George here?
Yes, he is.
Oh, okay. Hi, good afternoon. So George and I will give another update of the SB 211 case processing standards. Just a small reminder, this will be our last update in the format of a presentation before we submit our final proposal in early September. So we look forward to receiving feedback and input from you. An overview of what we have done before this presentation. We have gone over the 4 factors that need to be considered in our standards. I think most of us are very familiar with those 4 factors. We use case stage to represent mechanics of the discipline process. We have complexity indicator in our standards. We have risk level indicator in our standards. Then we also address reasonable expectation of the public by giving out the public survey and analyze the survey results. If you recall, in May presentation, we talked about the general takeaway is that the public expects 180 days to close non-complex cases and roughly 360 days to close complex cases. Another step we will take after this presentation, we will post a very brief standards about 3 to 4 pages to solicit public comment. Then 4 areas that we must reflect. In May presentation, we talked about our takeaways from our AO Office Legislative Analyst Office report, auditor report. We also shared some of our learning points by meeting with experts and also looking at other states' case processing standards. Again, this one we have shown before that this is our working process. Just to refresh everybody's memory, we started from where we are in terms of case processing times by case processing stage and by complexity level, by risk level. Then we used some statistical analysis. We call that 60-day gap analysis. We pretty much eliminate the 60-day gap between any 2 events in case processing procedures. Then we adjust that by review our learning points or takeaways from the factors that we are required to consider, which is here. Then the next step we have done between May and now, we did 5 focus groups, and we also presented our semi-final standards to the 5 focus groups, CTC, to obtain the feedback and input about those standards. Then today we're gonna show you what are the to-be standards in our final proposal, and also we will talk a little bit about our staffing requirement. So again, in May presentation, those are what we did presented last time. This time we will focus on ABA state comparison data. This year we decide to join ABA effort to participate in their survey, which is called Survey of Lawyer Discipline Survey. This is our first time to fully participate. We participated. Did anybody say anything? No? Okay. We participated part of the survey before. This year, we are joining, we're participating 100% of their survey. Another thing we want to update is we had more meetings with the experts, and we also presented this set of slides to them and obtained their feedback. The last one is the focus group. So experts' opinions, our major takeaways. So I'm not going to go through the opinions one by one, but I want to highlight a few changes we have made based on their opinion. One noticeable change is charging, the definition of charging. This time we clarified our time clock in charging will end at earliest of 3 occurrences: closure or dismissal in charging, notice of ENEC, filing of stipulation or NDC. So that's a little bit change based because we now do not count, for example, multiple ENEC meetings because some of the procedures here are out of OCTC's control. Another change we have made is that we assign complexity flag at the very beginning at the intake stage, but we'll also evaluate complexity determinations as after case is closed. So that's some adjustment we have made in our standards. Then the third change is OCTC will develop mechanism for assigning severity or risk level to cases. The last one is we said we will not have the full workload study, but we will at least lay out a plan for the full workload study. So in the plan, based on the feedback, not only from the experts, but also from the focus group, the staffing needs analysis will consider staff's years of experience, turnover rates, and other factors. So that's some changes we made. Then we had another conversation with IOAO. As you know, the proposal will be submitted to them for them to do the final review and evaluation. So, one change we have, one major takeaway is that they are interested in a lot of data, especially disaggregated data. That's one of our motivations to design more benchmark reports to provide more disaggregated data, not only at the end of a fiscal year, but also during the year that we know how cases progress through different case stages and monthly and quarterly. Another thing is that the case processing standards will apply to a certain group of cases. For the cases that are not included in the standards framework, we will still do different, the slightest data analysis for those cases. For example, abated cases will be analyzed in our ADR, although they will not be included in the case processing standards.
Madam Chair, if I could, I'm sorry for interrupting, Ms. Shang. I wanted to ask the chair if I could ask a question.
Please go ahead.
Could you go back one slide, please? Thank you. The very last, the very bottom there talks about the OCTC workforce needs stability and better training. I see that the change that's discussed on this slide speaks to the staffing needs analysis, but there's no discussion there of any changes to the training modes or modules that we have. Was that stuff discussed and just didn't make it onto the slide, or is that to be determined?
It's not on the slide because the training itself doesn't necessarily relate to the case processing standards at the time. It does relate to, and it is something that we are looking at. When we did the focus groups, and some comments were made as to how training is done, the timing of that training when people start. And so we will be looking at that and trying to work that in to try and speed up, which relates kind of to the years of experience, to try and speed up the time at which people get more comfortable handling a wider range of cases, which was one of the factors that was cited in the focus groups as something that contributes to delays in case processing, as people have to learn about the different types of cases they're handling.
Okay, thank you. That makes
Right.
sense.
I want to add that in the focus group, staff members provided a lot of good suggestions on training. So George will talk more in the slide of focus group. All right, let me speed this up a little. Now, so still LAO talked about benchmarks. Then another thing, they talked a lot about case type. They are hoping that we can at least explore the option of including specific case types in our final standards. And we did explore, but the conclusion is that our data did not support a clear time pattern. And for different case types, right now we have about 24 case types. So we are having difficulty in grouping them. Another complication is that one case may be involved in different case types. So they are not necessarily inclusive or independent from each other in terms of types. So our conclusion is that we are not going to include them in the final standards, but we will track specific types of cases to reevaluate whether we should include them for future analysis or include them in the future standards. Another thing is that P1, P2, P3, we talked a lot about our priority level tracking or reporting. Now the change is we will not report based on the priority level. We will report data and track cases based on complex and non-complex, high risk and low risk, those categories. So that's one change we have made. So I talked about those two notable changes. Then George will now talk about the ABA survey takeaway.
Sure. So we had talked about looking at some of the state data last time. We've broken it out more based on the ABA survey. We chose 2018 as a kind of base year. There's also data available for 2019, but we chose 2018 because it was, we think, kind of more clearly pre-pandemic, and also our data in 2019 was affected by a number of changes, including the implementation of Odyssey, and my understanding is a new case portal that may have affected our data for that year. So looking at 2018, kind of looking at our data as compared to other states, California is highlighted in blue there. You can see what you already know, which is that we have by far the most attorneys of any of the jurisdictions. Texas is the closest in terms of the number of attorneys. We also get by far the most complaints. We're close to double what the other closest state is, which is Texas. And then going across, and I have a separate slide at the end that highlights some of the key points from this. Then in terms of time frames, which is the next slide, you can see in terms of the average caseload per lawyer, our caseloads are lower on average than the national median, but higher than Texas's, which is the closest comparator. Our time from receipt of complaint to summary dismissal, which is basically the cases that we close an intake without any further investigation, currently is higher than most of the states. We don't have a national average for that, but for these 6 comparator states, you can see it's higher. Some of that has to do with how the different states process the cases and what they do in intake as compared to us. We actually do make requests in intake for additional information in a significant number of our cases, which some of the other states, we think, don't count towards their time in this. You can also see then in column 10, the average time from the receipt of complaint to closure dismissal after investigation. There, you can see we're kind of close to what New Jersey, Colorado, Arizona, and then Maryland gave this range. We're higher than Illinois or Texas. And then looking at the average time from receipt of complaint to filing of formal charges, you can see that we're much higher there in terms of moving towards actual charges. So some of the takeaways are in the next slide. We have more complaints. We have more cases that carry over from year to year, which is a function of the time it takes. We have more complaints closed at intake as a total number. We have fewer complaints that move to the investigation stage, again, as a total number. And again, those two numbers may be affected by the fact that at our intake stage, we actually do make requests for information. So we are doing some information gathering. Larger number of attorneys disciplined. The percent of attorneys disciplined is smaller than the national median, but again, it is higher than Texas, which is the most comparable state. And our caseload is lower than the national median, but higher than Texas, which is the most comparable state in terms of both numbers of attorneys and complaints. So those are some of the takeaways from the state data, or the best state data we have. Again, a lot of the numbers in the tables that the ABA produces are estimates, and it's not entirely clear that they're completely analogous to us, but that's what we have. In terms of focus groups, what we did was take the standards that we have along with some additional questions to get feedback. We did 5 focus groups, basically covering the intake phase, the investigation phase, and charging. An investigation was broken up amongst attorneys, investigators, and those who handle expedited investigations. Some of the takeaways in terms of the case processing standards that we proposed, which you'll see at the end. Generally, the attorneys and investigators thought that they were reasonable with sufficient staffing to bring overall caseloads down. Intake made this comment that while 30 days could be attainable as an average, there were cases in which additional information was requested, and generally that took between 40 and 60 days. They still thought that even factoring those cases in, an average of 30 was appropriate, because a large number of cases in which no additional information was needed would take a shorter time.
Madam Chair, if I may interrupt with a question for Mr. Cardona, please.
And
If that happens, that there's a need for additional information, is the complainant notified of that such that they can expect another little bit of extra time?
yes, and typically that request is a request to the complainant. So most of the requests and intake for additional information are directed to the complainant, so they're aware that we
makes
have
sense.
their complaint and are asking them often for very basic information, such as confirmation that they retained the attorney, things like that.
Okay, thank you.
And everybody should feel free to interrupt with questions. There's no need to wait till the end. In terms of charging, one of the primary comments was concern with the ENEC process, the Early Neutral Evaluation Conference, and it was noted that once that goes out, effectively we lose control, because then the state bar court judge schedules the ENECs, and there may be multiple, and then there's back and forth with the opposing counsel, all of which in California occurs pre-filing, which our experts noted was very unusual. They weren't aware of a similar process in any of the other states. Even with that, the attorneys thought that our 90-day timeframe for charging was reasonable if it excluded that time, but that if we were going to include that time, they thought that more time, in particular, they thought an additional 30 days should be included on average in the charging time to account for that.
Can I ask a related question, going back to one of the slides that Yoon showed us? In terms of the changes made in response to LAO feedback, cutting off the
Yes,
time
that's- Yeah,
where does
so-
that time go then? Like, does it
Yeah, that time-
disappear, or
No,
does it
that-
go to the
that-
next stage?
That time doesn't disappear. In other words, if in fact we ended up filing charges and proceeding, that time would still be included in the time to get to a disposition. It's
Right.
just that for purposes of our case processing standards, we would cut off the case processing effectively for coming up with a measure of the average time we spend in that stage, and for purposes of calculating backlog, which Yueen will talk about, we would cut it off there.
Okay.
It would still be there. So in other words, if we report in the ADR the time that it takes from the time we receive the complaint to the time we file charges, that time would still be there. That time would now differ from the time that we would be responsible from under the case processing standards.
I see. So it just goes to what gets put into the charging stage.
Right. It goes to where we cut off the charging stage for purposes of compliance with the case processing standards.
Got it.
But not necessarily for reporting purposes in the ADR where we would differentiate. Does that, okay.
Great.
In terms of staffing levels, you've already seen this, but both attorneys and investigators emphasize that, staff rotations and turnover are a huge suck on time, because when transfer cases are transferred, they take longer, takes time for people to get up to speed, and it delays their work on their already existing caseloads. They emphasized, particularly now when we have a very large number of very new investigators, such that our experience is down, that it takes longer to work cases for less experienced staff, something that I think everybody would accept. They also emphasized that we should consider ways to shift some of the duties to administrative staff to allow both the investigators and attorneys to focus on factual gathering and analysis. And we'll obviously look into that. Everybody also emphasized that their caseloads consist and include cases that aren't part of the case processing standards, which is true. All of these, there are a large number of cases that aren't included in the case processing standards, including the things I've listed there, and in particular post-transmittal criminal cases, of which we have a large number right now based on the fingerprinting project that was done. And those two take up time in terms of what's done. So moving to the next slide, some suggestions we got in terms of efficiency was a specialized team to handle criminal cases post-transmittal, trying to streamline our processes, in particular our processes for data entry and uploading into our case management system, which is there, and potentially restoring to intake the ability to make requests for information to respondents. Right now, that is all in investigation. The thought was to restore that ability to try and front load some of the information requests so that the information could either be obtained while the case was still in intake, or at least have the process for getting that information started at intake so that there was less of a delay in getting it for investigation. We'll look at that as well. Some thoughts about trying to limit the amount that investigators are required to write in their investigative reports in terms of narrative. And then a large emphasis on communication with complainants, which takes up a lot of time. One suggestion was that we provide more customer service training for our intake staff, that we try and come up with more efficient methods for communicating with both incarcerated complainants and complainants who require translators. Both of those add significant amount of times just in terms of mail time and receipt time. And for translators, particularly if it's not one of the common languages, finding a translator, getting that translation done on multiple occasions when we have to communicate with the complainant. Other thought was modifying the complaint form to try and give more information, which probably ties in with the public liaison, trying to get more information out there so that complainants have more information about just what is needed to get their complaint to move more smoothly on the front end. So those were suggestions that came up. So all of this, we tried to incorporate it. So basically our framework for the standards, the next slide, case stage, case complexity, we've all talked about. We're going to try and have the cases flagged for complexity at intake, so that when a case comes out of intake, it will have a flag for complexity, which will have to then be reevaluated as the case proceeds. Also trying to come up with a system for intake to designate cases as either high risk or low risk based on a number of factors that are laid out here. That would be the framework. Again, that would likely have to be reevaluated as the case moves through if any of those factors change. With that, here's where we are. You can see, again, as we talked about in May, we've moved from median to average. So these are all average times. The as-is standards are based on historical data with some adjustments for assumed process improvements. Then we do the 60-day gap adjustment to come up with those numbers. We did a qualitative adjustment based on our review of the various factors in SB 211, including the state data that we've looked at. And then adjustments based on our focus groups, the comments that were made with respect to intake and charging. And this is basically what we anticipate our report will propose as the case processing standards, with these as footnotes. So 30, 120, 150, 180, 210, and 300 as you move through those stages. Again, remember that these are average times. So this would be the average time for cases. There will be some cases beyond that take longer than that. There will be some cases that take less, but the goal would be to have this as an average. And because they are average cases, that relates to the next two slides, which Yueen is going to talk about, which is trying to come up with a backlog measure.
Okay, so the backlog measure if we take the approach that we look at 90 percentile cases, and we look at that as our backlog based on our historical data. So this is what has happened in the past 4 years. The mean average days for intake is 42 days. Based on the 90th percentile number, it's 163 days for intake, if that's treated as backlog. And obviously that's not reasonable. That doesn't meet the reasonable expectation. So what we propose here, this is what we propose, is that we look at our cases, assuming we have sufficient resources, and look at the bell curve of all the cases, and the 90th percentile, we expect them in intake stage will be in 45 days, half of the mean plus the average. Then those are the backlog final days for different types of cases at different stages. Any questions so far?
I don't see questions here.
So this is the final timeline. As we have shown before, the next step is solicit public comment. Then we will give our proposal to the 3 experts. Then after their feedback, we will submit that to the LAO for feedback. Then we will incorporate their feedback and submit the final proposal to the board.
Great, thank you. Any questions or comments? All right, George, remind us of the timeline for this again.
I mean, our ultimate deadline is we have to submit it to the legislature by October 31st. And so that's the goal we're shooting for. So we expect to be back before you in September with the final report proposal with all of the other things that Ewing has mentioned as feedback so that you can assess it. And we can make any final tweaks and get it ready for submission before October 31st.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Yoon.
Thank you.
Okay, that takes us to the end of our open session items. We will now move into closed session pursuant to Government Code Section 11126C2 to consider the items listed on the closed session agenda. The open session meeting is adjourned.
Are we ready? This is still red, so it's going to be on Highland, please.
But you've got your great summer suit on. All right, well, we are back in open session of the Regulation and Discipline Committee. Back from closed session, there was no reportable action. And so this meeting is adjourned.